Hey folks, my name is Ben Wiley and I'm a Senior Solutions Engineer from Census. In today's video, we want to first demonstrate how to seamlessly connect Snowflake data to Census in just a few minutes. Then from there, we'll demonstrate three common use cases that we see all the time. One, enriching HubSpot with contact data from Snowflake. Two, activating targeted audiences for marketing personalization. And three, triggering real-time notifications using Snowflake's dynamic tables and Census's live syncs. All right, let's dive into it. First things first, we want to connect Snowflake to Census so that we can start to access data living in Snowflake from directly within Census. Now going over to my Snowflake instance, you can see I have a number of different tables that I want to use within Census, such as users, website events, accounts, etc. Now the question becomes, how do I access this data from within Census? Jumping over to Census documentation, you can see that we've laid out a series of steps that we need to execute within Snowflake to make sure that we can connect Snowflake to Census. Essentially, what we're going to do here is we're going to create a user in Snowflake and then grant that user permissions to certain tables that are going to be relevant for use cases within Census. And once we've done and run these commands here, we can jump back over to Census, go to the Sources tab, and connect Snowflake. Now I've already got Snowflake connected. The process of connecting Snowflake looks at something a little bit like this, where we're going to be inputting a Snowflake account name, query execution warehouse, and then inputting those user credentials. There's a couple of other steps that you can take that are optional, but ultimately, once we've connected these credentials, we can save the source and test out the connection. And so what this is doing is we're testing to make sure that we can connect to Snowflake, making sure that we can connect to the relevant tables. And once we've done that, we should see a healthy Snowflake connection. And from here, we can start to access tables living in Snowflake directly from within Census, and we're off and running. Great. Now that we've got Snowflake connected, we can move on to our first use case where we will be enriching HubSpot with contact data from Snowflake. So I showed you a number of different tables in my Snowflake instance that I have today, but for this example, we're going to be using that users table. And you can see I've got a number of different fields that I can use to enrich HubSpot with. And so what we'll do is we'll take all of this information and sync it over to HubSpot. And so you can see we've got about 800 records already created within HubSpot. And what we'll do is we'll create new records and update existing records with records that we match on. Cool. So going back over to Census, to set up a new sync, the process is relatively straightforward. I'll click on the Syncs tab here and set up a new sync from scratch. And so what I'm going to do is select or tell Census where this data is coming from. In this case, I'm going to be using a table in the warehouse. So I'll select the schema and table, and I'll search for this users table. And then from here, I'll decide where I want this data to go and make sure Census understands how I want this data to land within the destination. So because we're using HubSpot, I've got a couple of different destinations already connected. I'll select HubSpot. And so what Census will do here is expose any syncable objects within HubSpot. And so as an example, you can see I've got a number of different objects. Census supports custom objects as well as all standard objects. And you can see I'll select this contact object here because ultimately that's where we want it to land within HubSpot. Now from here, it's about deciding how you want this data to be synced over. So for example, we've got a number of different sync behaviors. So we've got our traditional upsert, we've got our update only, and we've got our mirror sync behavior. Because I'm just syncing CRM and contact data over to HubSpot, I'm going to use this update or create sync behavior where Census is going to look to see if a record already exists. If a record exists, then we'll update it with new relevant information. Otherwise, we'll create a new record from scratch. The mirror sync behavior is similar to update or create. The only difference is that Census will remove records from HubSpot as they get removed from the source table. Now from here, it's about deciding which property from your users table you want to use Census to match on. So in this case, I'm going to use email as my sync key. And so what this means is that Census will use email address to match within HubSpot to see if a record already exists. And then from here, it's just a simple field mapping exercise. So we can decide what additional information we want to enrich HubSpot with. Now, as an example, I could select a source table column as well as a destination property. And what you can see is these are all of the available properties to sync to within the HubSpot contact object. There's a number of other things that I could do, like use sync metadata, use liquid templating, or even just set constant values. But ultimately, Census does some fuzzy matching to generate these mappings for us. So you can see that Census has just generated all of these mappings for us, but to keep things simple today, I'm going to only sync over a couple of different fields. So for example, I'll do last name, first name, as well as state and region. Now I could run a test where we sync over one singular record, but because I know what I'm doing, I'm going to create the sync and then trigger it manually. One thing to note is that when you're scheduling these syncs, you could have these run at whatever cadence you'd like. So it usually depends on the use case, but typically we see people updating data on an hourly basis at the top of the hour. Maybe they want to run these syncs daily at 9 a.m., or they can even have this run every 15 minutes or continuously. But ultimately, I'm going to trigger this manually for today's demo purposes. And so what I can do is run a dry run, which acts as a mock sync to see what the changes are going to be as soon as the sync is run. But because we're running a demo and we want to make sure that this data gets populated in HubSpot, I'm going to run this now. So now, as you can see, we've started this sync and it's in the process of running. And when this is all said and done, it should take no more than a few minutes. We should see a lot more information within HubSpot. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to pause this video in the interest of time and come back once the sync has finished running. So I'll see you in a few minutes. Okay, we can see that this sync has finished running. You can see about 124,000 records were updated in just a matter of 3 minutes. So now when we go back to HubSpot, we should see some additional records beyond just these initial 800 records. And voila, you can see that these records have been updated, and we can see that there's a number of different pieces of information that have been updated within HubSpot, such as first name, last name, email. We should even see a state in here somewhere. Great, so this is the first use case, and next we'll be moving on to activating targeted audiences for marketing personalization. All right, let's move on to our next use case where we're going to be activating targeted audiences for marketing personalization. So navigating over to our datasets tab, I've got a number of different datasets defined and configured within Census already. And largely these reflect the tables that we have within Snowflake. So jumping into this contact dataset, you can see I've set this up by writing a very simple SQL query where I'm pulling in that table of users from Snowflake and then doing some additional things on top of it. So as you can see on the right side here, this is the schema tied to this data set. So we've got a lot of information about users such as first name, last name, full name. But what I've also done is I've defined the relationships between the different data sets. So what we're doing here is essentially building a semantic layer into Census so that Census knows how to navigate Snowflake and lays the foundation for segmentation and activation. So as you can see, contact is related to purchase events by user ID in a one-to-many relationship. And so all of these data sets that I've defined within Census are related to each other in the following ways. So jumping back to this overview tab, again, as a user, I've got a number of different fields here that I can use for segmentation and activation. But let's say I'm running a marketing campaign where I'm using historical information to target high-value users, high-value B2B users. Maybe I want to understand what the lifetime value is of each user. Right now on this user's data set, I don't have that information. So what I'm going to do, instead of going back to my data team and writing SQL within Snowflake, I'm going to add an additional field to this data set through computed columns. So as you can see, there's a number of different computed column types. And in this case, because we're generating lifetime value, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this sum method. I'm going to select this purchase events because that's where my transactions are. Going to select total US dollars. And ultimately what we're going to do is we're going to sum the amount of money spent per user and then create a new field with that value. So I'll call this LTV. I can do additional things like add more filters to this computed column, but because we have a simple use case here, I'm just going to leave this as a sum method. So I'll create this I'll create this computed column, and we should see this show up here. So now if I preview the data, we'll have a lifetime value for each user as soon as I refresh this. After letting this refresh, you can see if I scroll to the right here that we've now got this LTV column that we can use for segmentation and activation. One of the other computed columns method, as I showed earlier, is GPT columns. And what this allows you to do is prompt Census to define a new data set using artificial intelligence and without having to write any SQL. So for example, if I go to this accounts data set, I've already got one of these fields set up where I'm telling Census to generate a new field based off of whether or not a company is a B2B company or B2C company, or both. So if I go to preview, you can see that for every company in this account list, we've added B2B or B2C. So now that we've got our data sets defined, we can go ahead and create segments and activate them into marketing automation platforms, CRM systems, ad platforms, and we'll talk about this in the next video. Great. So now that we have the right data sets in place, as well as the relevant fields that we're going to need to build audiences, let's go ahead and create an audience and activate that into destinations like ad platforms, marketing automation platforms, etc. So going over to our audience hub here, I'm going to click on the segments tab, and I've already got the base of this segment set up that we're going to use. So for today's example, we're going to be targeting VIB B2B contacts who have not made a purchase in the last 30 days. So right off the bat, what's happening here is we're using this contact data set as the foundation of our segment. There's about 125,000 contacts within this data set. And on the right side here, you'll see that there's a number of different filterable attributes. These are all of the different columns tied to that contact data set, and we can use these to start applying filters and narrowing down the scope of the audience. So right off the bat, if I'm going to run an email marketing campaign, I'm going to want to make sure that we have an email address for each contact record that's going to be included in this audience. Additionally, let's use that LTV field that we set up, and let's target users who have spent more than $1,000 with us over the course of their lifetime. As I apply these filters, we'll see this current size of the audience start to go down, and in that way we're getting more targeted with who we're including in this audience. So now let's go ahead and make sure we're targeting B2B users. So we'll use that accounts data set where we set up the B2B or B2C field using GPT columns. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to select B2B here. And again, we should start to see this go down in size. Great. So what I'm doing here is not only am I applying filters based off of attributes tied to the contact data set, I can also use related data sets, which is what we enabled when we defined the relationships between each of these data sets, building that semantic layer. So in this case, I'm going to cross-reference this purchase events data set, and I'm going to target users who have not made a purchase any number of times within the last 30 days. So again, we're applying filters based off of multiple different data sets and not just one table. And this allows us to eliminate a lot of the data engineering work required to mash together many tables for segmentation. Lastly, let's make sure that we're not targeting any users or including any users who have explicitly opted out of email marketing. So you can see that I have other segments here, and what this does is effectively nest existing segments within this segment. And so when we go to look at the SQL, what's happening here is Census is generating this SQL query on behalf of the user, and then we'll use this at runtime, sync runtime, and query the Snowflake using this. Great. So I'm going to save this segment, and now we can actually go ahead and activate this segment. So there's a number of different tabs up here, but today we're going to focus on destinations. And so what you'll see here is that I've got a couple of different ad platforms already hooked up to my Census workspace. And so if I just wanted to turn this on to, let's say, Google ads or Facebook ads, it's just a matter of clicking this button here. And additionally, what will happen over time is Census will start to pull in match rates and match records in the ad platform destination based off of these synced identifiers. But let's go ahead and sync this VIP B2B contacts audience over to HubSpot. So I already got a sync set up. We don't need to run through the sync setup process because we've done that already. But essentially what I'm doing here is I'm using this segment as the foundation of my sync, and I'm going to sync it to the contact and static list object within HubSpot. And as I do so, I'm creating a new list in HubSpot using Census. So I'll go ahead and run this. And as this is running, we could talk through a couple of different things. The first one being is that every time a sync is run, Census will look to see if users or contacts meet or exit the criteria set forth in the audience. So Census will automatically add users to HubSpot's contact and static list object anytime a user meets the criteria of this audience. And similarly, if someone now maybe opts out or doesn't meet the criteria of the audience, Census will automatically remove that contact from HubSpot as well as the audience within Census. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pause the video and let this run. And when this is all finished, we should see a new list within HubSpot here. Great, so this sync has finished running. It took about 5 minutes and Census processed about 2,300 records into HubSpot. So now when we go back over to HubSpot, we should see the newly created list as well as all of the relevant contacts tied to that list. So I'll jump over to HubSpot, I'll refresh the page, and here's the list that we just created within Census, and as well as all of the contacts tied to that. So now Census, every time a sync runs, will add or remove users as necessary as they meet or exit the criteria of the audience within Census. And we can go ahead and use this to run various marketing campaigns. Great, we'll see you in the next video. All right, last but certainly not least, we want to demonstrate use case 3 where we'll be triggering real-time notifications using Snowflake's dynamic tables and Census's live syncs. Cool, so let's dive into it. If I jump over to my syncs tab here, you can see I've got this live syncs already set up and running. There's a couple of key differences to point out here. The first is that we're pointing Census directly at that dynamic table rather than a Census dataset or a Census audience. And we're going to be sending records to some destination where we can trigger those real-time notifications. In this case, I'm going to be using Braze. Additionally, the behavior is send rather than an update or create or an update only. And lastly, the run mode is live, so this sync is running at all times. And the key difference here is that rather than having Census pull the data warehouse to see if there's new information or changed data, Census is always listening to a table, and as soon as an event or a record gets published to a table, Census will activate that record. So for example, I've got a table here. This is the table that I have Census hooked up to, and you can see the records tied to this so far. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to insert a new record into this table, and we should see a new email come through using Braze to my email address here. So I'll go ahead and I'll run this. I'll say demo 9.3 just so we can see that change happen. And so I'll run this. And as soon as I do that, we should be able to refresh this page here, scroll down and see here's that new record. So again, what I've done is I've published a new record to that table or to this table. And what Census is going to do is pick up on that using this live sync. And within a few seconds, we should see this email come through, and there it is. So again, This is all happening in real time, so you can enable many different types of use cases that require fast data versus slow data. But again, this has been a demo using Census's live syncs in Snowflake's dynamic tables. We'll see you in the next one. Thanks. All right, with that, we conclude our demonstrations for the video. To recap, we walked through 3 common use cases. 1, enriching HubSpot with contact data from Snowflake. 2, activating targeted audiences for marketing personalization. And 3, triggering real-time notifications using Snowflake's dynamic tables and Census's live syncs. Thank you all for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful day.